She is first and foremost a wife. She is also a mom of two kids. She is what I just learned today as an internist. And if anyone is unfamiliar with what an internist is, it is simply a doctor of internal medicine. She is also a mindset and manifestation mentor, which I'm sure we are going to get into today. And she is the founder of the Aligned MD. So I would like to introduce everyone who's watching or listening to a Dr. Sana Chaudhry.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you so much for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Honestly, it's an honor when I get to talk to people from a variety of different professions. I feel that they help in my own journey. You and I were talking off camera that you recently had a whole shift in your career, a whole lifestyle shift. You and your husband relocated from the wonderful windy city of Chicago, and now you're living in the Sunshine State, I believe is what they call Florida, the Sunshine State. And so, first and foremost, the question that I want to lead with right off the bat is I don't know if you would consider them contradictions or complementary, but I hear that you are a doctor of internal medicine, but then I also see that you're a mindset and manifestation manner. Is there a difference between the two? Or is there some type of connection that is perhaps unbeknownst to me?
That's a great question. So to me, everything is connected, right? I think there's a connection between most things, and I think there's certainly a connection here. But the distinction is the way modern medicine is practiced today, unfortunately, doesn't take into account the holistic aspect as much. Again, just the mental health, the well being, taking into account spirituality, food, certainly, right? To me, food is medicine. So just that big picture oftentimes is ignored in modern day medicine because we're just so focused on just treating what we're seeing, right? Just treating what's happening. But
Mm,
oftentimes, what we're treating is really just a symptom of a lot of things that are underlying that we may not be addressing, right? So that's just how modern medicine works. And that's a whole other conversation. We could talk about that for a long, long time. But to me, they are certainly connected. Wellness, mindset, 100% affects your physical health and vice versa, right? So there's the mind and body connection and body and mind connection. So it goes both ways. But yes, the wellness, the mindset manifestation, spirituality, and just your physical health, which, again, we can just say, medicine as people know it, are very much interconnected and go hand in hand, in my opinion.
You referenced a couple of different things that I have heard time and time again. And if anybody goes on my Instagram page, you're going to see multiple videos where we talk about this mind body connection, this body mind connection, as you mentioned. I recently had a conversation with someone that said we don't necessarily heal through or from our mind, we heal through and from our body. And so, a question that I can't help but ask because you seemingly practice in what I would maybe consider as two different specialties, is one greater than the other? In other words, is the mind greater than the body? Is the body greater than mind? Does one lead and the other follows? Or does it really not matter and it's somewhat irrelevant?
That's such a great question too. Again, as you're asking me this, what I want to say is that the mind leads, right? Because that's what I teach. That's what I now teach. And your mind really does affect everything, including your physical health. However, an important thing to know too is that your body is not just something that follows. Your body is obviously connected to your mind, and your body itself keeps score too. There's actually a really good book by that title, Your Body Keeps Score. And it really does, right? So, for example, I talk a lot about burnout. I talk a lot about stress, and stress isn't just a mental thing. It ends up becoming a physical thing. There's a reason you feel that tension in your shoulders. There's a reason you get lower back pain. There's a reason you get headaches, right? Chronic headaches. It's again your body. So it's hard to really separate that connection. It's really just one and the same thing, just looking at two different sides of it is the way I would say. But when you're working on your healing journey, right, it starts both ways, right? So what I teach my clients and what I am such a huge proponent of, it goes both ways. So you're doing the mindset work and you're also doing somatic healing. And I start with doing the somatic healing and calming your body and teaching your nervous system that it's safe before we do anything else. Because if you're building on a foundation that's lacking or that's broken, you're just not. Nothing's really going to stick on top of that, right? So the foundational work that you have to do when you're working on yourself or personal development or mindset work or trying to, become a different version of yourself, it all to me really starts with coming back to yourself and calming your nervous system, regulating your nervous system. We hear that a lot today. Nervous system has just become very big, and I'm so glad that it
Yeah.
has. And this is work that really needs to be done and talked about more. And that's where we start, right? We start with regulating your nervous system. That really is the foundation upon which we build anything else. So you can't, in my opinion, really separate the two. Your mind affects your body, and your body certainly keeps score. But when you're working on healing, it goes both ways, right? We do the mindset work, but we're also doing somatic, physical, actual healing, which may involve sometimes silly things like literally doing a shake off or dancing or, things like that. But that's the kind of somatic healing, breath work, certainly, right? But once again, working with your body to calm your mind down, and then working with your mind, rewiring your identity, forming new neural pathways, new neural patterns to then work on your body. So they really do go hand in hand.
The book that you're referencing, if anyone is unfamiliar, the book that she's referencing is by Bessel van der Kolk. It's called The Body Keeps Score. And it is something that I have been absolutely fascinated by. One of the questions that I can't help but ask, even when I'm listening to this, especially in light of what you talked about, nervous system regulation. In addition to this conversation, there is also terminology called a dysregulated nervous system or a deregulated nervous system. I recently had a conversation with a doctor of osteopathy. And in the course of that conversation, we talked about the body keeping score. We talked about this relationship between our body and our mind. And the question is simply this: does a dysregulated nervous system, does maybe an imbalanced mental health within ourselves, do those realities make our physical bodies more susceptible to things that we experience? In other words, people talk about chronic pain, people talk about inflammation. If the body keeps score, I can't help but wonder if everything potentially begins with the mind. Does our mind and a dysregulated nervous system make our physical bodies more susceptible things that we should maybe be immune from or have a higher tolerance for?
I believe so. I really do believe so. And again, I say that with the caveat that they're both, again, we're trying to separate body and mind, which is hard to do. However, I do believe it does start with the mind, right? So when you're living in high stress, chronically dysregulated nervous system, your body has been running on high stress hormones for so long that, for example, even when you rest, you don't really recover, right? Which is why going on vacation or taking a long weekend or, having a spa day doesn't really necessarily, it's not going to get rid of burnout, right? It may help you feel better if you're feeling tired, but burnout doesn't go away with just resting, right? Because again, that's a dysregulated nervous system. And now your body has been keeping score, right? So you have to start with, again, that somatic healing. And it takes time, right? Like, depending on, again, because there's degrees of burnout too, depending on where you are on that scale of burnout, some people may need a shorter duration of work with their nervous system to start feeling better and then just keep working from that place. Some people, it may take months for them to start feeling better and feeling like themselves. But again, I really do think that your mind does affect everything else. Whether we're talking about rewiring your, your brain to create a new identity, or whether we're talking about, healing from burnout, or whether we're talking about manifestation. And, I teach my clients all of those as well, right? So, and I know you mentioned my program at the very beginning, but those are some of the things that I talk with my clients about in the program. All of that really does come back to really your mind, to really your nervous system being regulated. And in my opinion, I think that's where we should be starting when we're trying to create any kind of change.
What would you say are the signs and the sources of a dysregulated nervous system? Is it black and white or is it more nuanced?
It's really listening to your own body, right? So everyone has a different threshold, different baseline. And if you're feeling off, right, in any kind of way, I think it's important for us to pause to ask, like, hey, what's going on? Like, and so many of us today, because we're so busy, whether we're parenting, whether we're working, I'll use my example, especially in healthcare, we're actually taught to ignore our own bodies, right? We're taught to not pay attention to how tired we are. We're working 80 hours in training, and that's just normalized and often celebrated. Like, oh my gosh, dude, you worked 80 hours, like high five, like that's amazing. Yeah, it is. But what you're doing on the flip side of that is you're actually teaching your body to not pay attention to your body. You're actually doing the opposite of what we should be doing. And what I teach, again, to come back to yourself and regulating your nervous system, which is again paying attention to your body, right? So it is black and white in the sense that if you're feeling off and your body's feeling off and you're now all of a sudden starting to have daily headaches or chronic like shoulder tension, like, ask yourself why, right? Like it's black and white in that sense. It's really as simple as like, why do I feel off, right? But it's a little bit nuanced that your symptoms may vary. People may have a headache more often than usual. Some people may carry that tension in their shoulders. Some people may have lower back pain. Some people may have Heck, even fibromyalgia. Some people may have, how it's going to show up for you will be different. For most people, it's, that I talk to, it's slightly different symptoms, right? But the commonality is that something is still off, right? So
Mm.
I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a little bit of both, really, in my opinion.
It does answer my question, and there is a phrase that you used earlier that I've heard in podcasts and I've heard online, especially on social media. One of my favorite podcast hosts is very passionate about this concept, and it's the concept of neural pathways. And can you describe for me what a neural pathway is? And is it possible to either create new neural pathways or are we reprogramming old neural pathways? I guess the question is twofold.
Mhm. So definitely, yes. So to answer to answer both, I'll start with the first one. So what is it? It's basically just connections between your neurons, right? So that is how that's how we function. It's how our neurons communicate with each other, right? And we used to think back in the day that once you're an adult, your brain is formed. It is what it is. You can't change. You can't form new neural pathways. Your brain is not plastic. Luckily and thankfully, we now know that that's not true. Your brain is plastic your entire life, right? You can form new neural pathways your entire life. It's a little bit harder to do, after the age of 40, but definitely not impossible. But there's ways again you can kind of biohack and hack your own brain to kind of jumpstart that process. For example, if you're using two senses at the same time, while either writing or listening to music or doing something new at the same time, that's again using multiple sensory pathways. That's going to help form new neural pathways. But long story short, yes, certainly your brain is plastic. You can form new neural connections really at any age, and that's the work we should all be doing, right? We should all be working on ourselves. We should all be learning new skills. We should all be, but again, the problem ends up becoming that we're all so busy in our lives day to day that we all end up just following the same routine that we have morning to night. We're not so often really even thinking about nurturing our brains, right? Or forming like, I mean, who's sitting there thinking about, I want to form new neural pathways, right? But it is really important. Like that needs to happen for any kind of growth to happen, right? Which is why it's so much easier for kids to do because they're continuously getting into new things. They're trying different things. They're trying different sports and musical instruments. They're, going on vacations a lot more. Like every experience for a kid is a new experience, right? For adults, the things that we have already done is no longer a new experience. We don't experience new things as much as adults, which is why it's a little bit harder for us to form those new neural connections, but certainly not impossible. So yes, neural pathways are just connections between your neurons. That's how the brain cells, that's just how neurons in general, because there's neurons outside of your brain as well, communicate. And yes, 100% you can form new neural pathways. That's what neuroplasticity is. We luckily know now that that is the case. We can do that really at any age.
You actually just either segued into a question that I was thinking of while you were speaking, or you answered it altogether because there were two questions that I wanted to ask more so for an education for me. And there are two words that I have seen time and time again, and it's the word neuroplasticity, but there's also the other word, which is neurodivergent. And so, simply because I am curious, I am a sponge and I want to learn, can you define or describe for me as best you can what those two are? Number one, neuroplasticity, but also number two, neurodivergent.
Yeah. So again, great question. So neuroplasticity, we kind of talked about, right? Neuroplasticity again just means that our brains are plastic. It's not what we used to think, where we thought that you couldn't, as adults, learn new things or you couldn't grow or form new neural connections, right? So it really is just what the word says. So neuroplasticity, so neuroplastic, our brains are plastic and they are malleable and we can change and we can form new neural connections, right? So neurodivergent, it's describing people whose brains process, learn, and behave differently from what society considers neurotypical, right? So that's a little bit different, but in terms of what we are talking about, really, neuroplasticity is what would apply more, just in terms of creating change and just, when you're working on yourself, whether that's again in terms of somatic healing or in terms of, trying to become someone different, right? That's where the neuroplasticity side applies a little bit more, if
Mm,
that makes sense.
it makes sense. And there is a pop culture reference, and the movie franchise has been around for probably more than 2 decades. But the movie series that I'm referring to is, of course, The Matrix. And the scene that I am particularly thinking of is when Neo is first unplugged from the Matrix. And he could not handle what they referred to as the real world because he had been living in the Matrix for so long. And in the movie, there's a scene where Morpheus is speaking with him and says they have a rule, and that's they never unplug someone beyond a certain age because the mind can't handle it, because it has developed patterns and habits and familiarity and comfort. With that being said, you used a word that I have not heard before. I've heard of neuroplasticity, I've heard of neural pathways, I've heard of neurodivergent, but you used a word neurotypical. So, what is neurotypical and how is it relevant or important for us?
So I think again, in terms of how I would define it, I think it would just be what we consider neurotypical, which is again like normal, right? In terms of neurodivergence, so like an example of neurodivergence would be autism, right? But you're comparing that again to a neurotypical. It doesn't mean like again, autism, a lot of people that have autism have skills that neurotypical people can't even begin to even compete with, right? But it's again now we're starting to have an interesting conversation. But it really is exactly that, right? Like you're comparing two different things. So neurodivergent example that we're using right now, autism, right? Versus like a normal person who doesn't have those skills. And now you're comparing autism with neurotypical. So neurotypical, I would say, is just everyone else, right? And neurodivergent, there's a lot of things that fall under that. But if we're talking about the example I or you just used, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that falls more under neuroplasticity or neurodivergent, maybe a little bit of both, to be honest with you. That's interesting. I never really thought about that matrix example, but yeah, I think that would probably be a little bit of both if I had to say.
Here's a question. Does neuroplasticity look different or the same for someone that's neurodivergent versus someone that's neurotypical? Would they undergo the same process? Because I recently encountered someone who was considered neurodivergent, was diagnosed with autism, but also experienced an amount of trauma during childhood years, beginning with the age of 5. So for 4 years, not only was there the presence of trauma and the continued manifestation of it within their lives, but there was also the contention with the autism. So is neuroplasticity something that is the same regardless of neurodivergent or neurotypical? Or is there somehow a different way that each would process that?
I think neuroplasticity, just again, if we're just sticking to the strict definition of it, just the brain's ability to form new neural connections, that in and of itself would be the same. But in terms of, and again, our brains are so complex, right? This would be a little bit out of my scope if I'm being completely honest too. And I say this because our brains are so complex and just the intricate balance of the neurotransmitters within our brains and just how we process things. And every single one of us is a little bit different when it comes to that. But just us humans in general, if we're sticking with just neurotypical adults, right? That and not we're not talking about neurodivergent, sure, neuroplasticity obviously we know exists. But in terms of just that delicate balance that we're dealing with, the different neurotransmitters, right? And I'm thinking specifically now of people that have seizures and just their threshold for example, GABA, which is the inhibitory neurotransmitter, is different than people that don't have seizures, right? And now if we're talking about people that have autism, quite frankly, I don't know how their brain chemicals are necessarily different than someone who doesn't have autism or someone who is neurotypical, right? I don't know if I'm the right person to speak on that. Like that's something I would love to look into. That's very interesting. I haven't really thought about that to be honest with you, but it would be different, right? It would be different in some capacity, right? Because the two are not the same. But I don't know what that is, to be honest with you. But yes, in terms of just like plain neuroplasticity, our brain's plastic, can they still form new neural connections? Yes, because even autistic people, right? There's growth. Like when someone is a child with autism versus when they're an adult with autism, right? Their brain's not the same, right? Same as a person without autism, right? Their brains have grown and will continue to grow. And that in and of itself is neuroplasticity. But how do the two vary? Like how do their brain chemicals, just for the layman's terms to call it that for our conversation, how do those vary? I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, at least not in the proportions. Like what is it that's making neuroplasticity different in the two? I would have to look. That would be a good conversation to
Mm,
have with my husband, probably. He's a neurologist. He may know the answer to that.
I would love to have a conversation with a neurologist. I think that would be fantastic. There's so many questions that I would ask a neurologist, just even regarding my
Yeah.
own physical body. So there is the icon that you can get on your driver's license if you want to, and it is simply an organ donor. And in the event that, God forbid, something happens and someone needs any type of transplant, there is the possibility of taking someone else's organ. Let's just use the heart transplant, for instance, but you can't just take any heart. It has to be compatible in order for it to actually function within your body. And then, of course, we're not going to get into the conversation of blood types. The reason why I ask that is because when you're talking about neuroplasticity, when you're talking about creating new neural pathways, how do you know when, number one, a new neural pathway has been created? But also, number two, how do you know when it's even been successful, especially if perhaps the success of it depends on you being able to rewire yourself, be able to move on from unprocessed trauma, be able to manifest? How do you know when it has actually been successful?
So, in terms of, again, if it's a new physical ability that you're working on, for example, you're trying a new skill for the first time, like gymnastics or something, right? Like the first time you do something, you're going to fall. The first time you try to do a flip, you're probably not going to do it right. So, even from that first moment, right, the work is starting to happen. Your new neurons are starting to form. But in terms of that connection to be established and be strengthened, that takes time, it takes repetition, and it takes practice, right? So, for a physical ability, again, repetition and practice. And the way you would know that it's formed is that that thing will just then become easy to do. And your brain is just such a beautiful thing. It's constantly working. It's doing that on a daily basis all the time, right? New
Hmm.
neural connections will try to form, but whether or not they stick depends on whether or not you're repeating something and doing it consistently and doing it with intention, like like for again, for a physical ability, if you're doing it consistently and doing it repeatedly, right, and then that thing that was once hard to do will not be hard to do, right? So that's how you would know for a physical ability. For things like rewiring your identity, which is again working on your subconscious mind and working on your beliefs, that's a little bit harder to do because you don't have something tangible to look at, like, hey, I couldn't do a backflip before, I could do it now, like my brain knows how to do it, right? So that's how you know that you can do that. But how do you know with, for example, again, rewiring a belief, rewiring, your subconscious beliefs? Those are hard to do. And that's tricky work too, because you're dealing with deep rooted subconscious beliefs. And now again, you're dealing with the mind in addition to the brain, right? So it's not necessarily as tangible to look at. Uh, And that's where it takes a little bit longer, but it 100% is doable, but you just have to look at it in a different way, right? So, for example, if you're
Mm.
working on becoming a different person or rewiring your identity, you're going to, and if if you have a good idea of who you want to be and the kind of person you want to be, what does she look like? How does she dress? How does she talk? How does she show up for herself? How does she show up for her kids? Like, how does she show up to work? Right? All of those things. You have that idea in your mind. And in the beginning, say for example, and again, there's a lot more that goes into this, but just to give you an example for our conversation, in the beginning, when you try to show up as her and do something as her, it may feel like you have imposter syndrome, or it may feel like, hey, this isn't really me. And this is true. It's not really you, right? But again, with you just even dressing up as her or even talking as her, those little new neural connections starting to form. What's going to make them stick once again is consistency, continue to do something over and over. So repetition and doing something with emotion, right? So that's really how you're forming new neural pathways. So sticking to it, doing it with emotion, doing it with feeling. And then how you're going to know again, because it's not as tangible, is that a few months down the line or a few weeks down the line, like dressing like her is just going to be second nature to you. Like you're not even going to think about it and you're wearing the clothes that at that point, like, that ideal version of you is wearing, right? And you're talking like her. And now it doesn't feel like effort. Now it doesn't feel like you're even trying. Like this is just who you are now, right? And that gap, that's where most people fall through and are not consistent. But that's really where the magic happens, right? Like just sticking to it, showing up, being consistent, and just really getting to the other side of it. And where is the other side? That's hard to define. It's different for different people, right? And that time duration is different too. But the stronger that you are in that, and the more committed that you are, and the more consistently that you do it, and the more emotions and feelings, that being the last two being key, that you do it with, that time gets shorter and shorter and you can collapse it, right? So I know now we're getting a little bit more into the identity shift and the manifestation piece of it too, but really to me, it is all connected.
I have focused a tremendous amount of time, effort, and energy on this concept of identity. And there's something that I am not quite understanding, or maybe I'm missing. And you've referenced identity multiple times in this conversation, and you use the word manifest in what you do. It's in your bio on your Instagram page. I believe you've used the word manifest a new identity, or some other people might talk about creating a new identity. When we speak about identity, is it the manifestation or the creation of a new identity? In other words, someone that, as you mentioned, imposter syndrome, we haven't been familiar with before? Or is it discovering the true version of ourselves that we have been our entire lives? It just might have been buried beneath years of trauma and a dysregulated nervous system.
So I love that question. I think it's a little bit of both, right? I think there's a version of you, every single version of you already exists, right? And now we're talking about quantum physics, but it's true. I mean, particles exist as waveforms and possibilities until they're observed, right? And when they're observed, that's when that particle becomes a reality, right? So we know this from quantum physics, right? The same obviously is true for you, Stephen. Every version of Stephen exists, right? It's out there. It exists in the
Mhm,
universe, right? However, the version of Stephen sitting here talking to me is a version of Stephen that you have observed and you have focused on, because this is the version that you associate with your traits, your personalities, again, what you wear, how you dress up, like how you talk, how you show up, right? That is what you have been observing thus far in your life. So that's the Stephen that I'm now sitting here having a conversation with. But a Stephen, who dresses differently, is into like, different music and like talks differently and has a different accent, maybe lives in a different country. He already exists too, but the reason I'm not sitting here talking to him is because that's not the Stephen you thus far in your life has observed, you know? So
mhm,
that's really I mean, it's not two different things. If you feel a strong pull towards something, right? If there's a thing, if there's a thought you can't get out of your mind, in my humble opinion, there's a reason for that. Right? There's a reason you identify with certain things. It's because a version of you on some level associates with that and can relate to that, and that feels familiar for a reason, right? So if there's, for example, a career change or a pull to us to move to a different place, right? Those feelings are not there for no reason. I mean, they're there for a reason. It's because a part of us can associate with those things. So identity
mhm,
is, again, really just what we have observed about ourselves thus far, personality traits or habits, everything that defines who we are. And that's our current identity, right? But once again, it doesn't mean your identity can't be changed. It's just that that's just what we have focused on thus far. I don't know if that answered your question.
mhm.
We can
It
dissect
did,
that.
but well, what's interesting about that is if anybody has had an iPhone or an Android or a tablet or any type of computer, there is this continued need that arises, and it's for a software update. And as you progress with the life of your phone, you will update your software multiple times. Each software update, it may come with fixes for different bugs that arose. When we're talking about identity and when we're talking about creating a new one, I want to talk about it from the lens of a software update or a software upgrade. You talked about the version of ourself. Is there a version of ourself that is what I would maybe call the true version of ourself? And then once we discover it, we settle into that version? Or is it not something that is as black and white in that? And that the version of ourselves that we may discover at 40, it's also possible to discover a new version maybe at the age of 50 or maybe at the age of 75?
I believe it's really more the latter. I don't I think your core values may be there, right? Again, but those two are your subconscious beliefs that have been installed in us since we were before the age of 7, right? But in terms of having one true version of ourselves, I don't know. I think again, it goes back to the conversation we were having earlier. I think this is malleable. Our brains are malleable. Your identity can definitely change. Just even looking back, right? Like when, just using a personal example, looking back at a version of me from when I was 15 years old to who I am today, there's almost times where like I don't even recognize that person, right? And it's in my opinion, I think that's true. So I don't know if there's one true version of ourselves. I think, like you said, software software upgrade too. I mean, there's a lot of similarities in software, right? Like if you're upgrading from a 13 to a 14, there's a lot of similarities. Nonetheless, we'll just use the upgrade example just for the upgrade part of it. I think that upgrade is necessary, I think, in life. And if we're working on ourselves, the upgrade needs to happen. But to answer your second question, if there's one true version of ourselves, I don't know. I don't think that there is. I think their identities change over time. I say this with a caveat. if you are working on changing yourself, right? There's some people that don't ever work on themselves and their identity doesn't change and they are who they are for decades at a time, and that's that, right? That's that fact. But if you're someone who is actively working on yourself and is continuing to evolve and is continuing to pour into himself, then that version of you that were maybe 10 years ago to who you are today is very unlikely to be the same person, right? So, one true version, I don't know. I think we evolve throughout our lives. I really do. And especially if you're someone who likes to work on themselves, is into personal development, who wants to evolve, who wants to change, because that's really where growth happens, right? If we're staying stagnant, whether that's mentally or physically, I mean, that's not, that's not change, obviously, right? We're just staying the same. But if you are working on changing, then I don't know if the one true version would even be applicable.
There's a concept and a phrase that has been alluded to multiple times throughout this conversation. It's something where, as we round this conversation off, I really want to get an understanding of, and that's this concept of manifestation. And your profile, if I pull it up, your profile talks about rewire your nervous system to manifest more. It also references neuroscience backed manifestation. So, my question is, what does manifestation look like? What is it that we are manifesting? And this might be a question for part two, and maybe we can table this, but are there certain things that we can manifest and certain things that we cannot or are maybe restricted or prohibited from manifesting?
It's a great question. The second one, especially. So let's start with the first one, right? So what is manifestation, right? It's talked about so much today, and I think it's one of those terms. And if I'm being completely honest, I was hesitant to even put on my profile because, again, my with my science background, manifestation is oftentimes thought of as woo woo, or again more in the
Hmm.
spiritual realm and not so much science. But to me, manifestation is neuroscience, right? Manifestation really is just the practice of turning your thoughts, your beliefs into your physical reality, right? And the way that that happens is really it's all rooted in your thoughts, right? It's rooted in your mindset, right? Because your thoughts, they become your feelings become your actions, and your actions become your results, right? So you're getting your
Hmm.
results really from your thoughts, right? So if you work on changing your thoughts, eventually you will change your results, right? Sure, there's, stuff that goes in between that, but that's really how it happens. And thoughts really are things. I mean, they're powerful things, right? You really do think on frequencies as well. So I know I'm talking about a lot of different things, but it really is all connected, especially when it comes to manifestation. So to me, there is not really much of a distinction between the spiritual side of things, between neuroscience, between manifestation. And the other thing about manifestation, which I think most people don't really think about, is that we're all always manifesting, right? It's not that, I can manifest and you can't, or, you know how to do it better than I like, it's not that we're all always manifesting. The question really is, are we doing it consciously or are we doing it subconsciously? Are we just going with the flow and just doing it subconsciously, right? We're all always manifesting. But the art of manifesting when it comes to that side of it is really just learning how to control your thoughts, right? How
Hmm.
to control what you're focusing on. Because once you figure out how to control your thoughts and how to control what you focus on, again, choose to focus on. And now I'm going to just tap back into our quantum physics conversation for a second, too. Just choosing what you focus on, you 100% can change the results that you get in your life, right? So there's no
Yeah.
distinction in the 3, right? So, I'm a person of faith as well, and, I'm Muslim, and everything that we're taught in Islam to just your faith in God, and, there's a concept of tawakkul, like, expecting the best, right? Expecting the best from God. But again, it all ties back to your mindset and your thoughts, right? And that's really how you end up getting the results that you want in life. And if you've been living with certain thought patterns and you're getting if let's do it backwards. If you're getting results in your life repeatedly, the results that you don't want, there's a good chance that there's something missing, in the steps that come before that. And most likely there's something in your thought pattern that is not giving you the results that you actually want in your life. It's more likely that, again, for example, just to take finances for a reason, right? If you're constantly focusing on what you don't have, if you're constantly focused on your build and how you're looking at your account balance and what you don't have, again, your focus is what I don't have, I don't have this, I can't do this, I don't have enough money for this. That's what your focus is. Your focus is not in abundance. Your focus is not thinking like there's enough money for everybody. I deserve wealth. There is money loves me and I love money. If you're not thinking about things like that, there's a very good chance you're gonna see scarcity in the financial side of things, right? So it really does all start with your thoughts. Thoughts really are things. Thoughts are things, and those are the things that give us the results at the end, right? So
Mm.
to me, I know I just really gave you the nutshell version of my definition of manifestation, but that really is manifestation to me. It really is as simple as that. It starts with your mindset to get the results that you want. We can talk about
Mm.
manifestation all day too. I love this topic, obviously, but that'll be a much longer conversation. So I'm trying to give you the condensed answer to that.
Consider this a formal invitation for a part two because I want to talk about this concept of manifestation even further. You referenced you being a woman of faith, you've referenced spirituality. As someone like myself who grew up in the church, there is a verse in the Bible that talks about out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. We're not going to get into this conversation here, but one of the things that I do want to prepare the listeners and the viewers for, and perhaps our next conversation, is if there is a connection between what we perhaps manifest with our minds as well as what we quote unquote may manifest with our mouth. Is it possible to contradict the other as far as what we manifest, what we speak with our mouths can inhibit or can restrict what we would want to manifest with our minds? I think that that is a fascinating conversation because I would love to dive into how important it is for there to be this merger or this balance or this marriage between thoughts and words, similar to how people would talk about thoughts and feelings. Is there a connection between what we say, even when we say, I am anxious? I am stressed. Whatever we put after that, I am, and how that directly impacts us as well. So, with all of that being said, I want to thank you for your time and for your willingness to have the conversation. I think we have packed a lot in such a short period of time. And I personally am looking forward to perhaps a round two. And maybe if it's in the cards and your husband is willing, I would love to have a conversation with an actual neurologist and be able to talk about some of these things, perhaps even on a deeper level.
Yeah, we can even all sit down and have a conversation. I mean, he and I talk about this stuff all the time at home, right? We have super fun conversations. And I told him too, I'm like, look, I'm not ready for it right now, but down the line, I would love to have like a podcast with just us just talking because I think people would love to hear some of the things that we talk about. So yes, I think that would be wonderful. And before we wrap up, I know when we were talking about the one true version of ourselves, something that came to mind, and I believe this is from the book The Untethered Soul. There's a Shakespeare quote, right, from which is to thine own self be true, right? And in that book, it mentions,
Hmm.
I think it's in the first chapter, it mentions, but to which self am I being true to, right? And that line just stood out to
Hmm.
me so much. So because we were talking about that, I just wanted to add that here. And that's so true, right? Which version of you, right? However, is there really one version of you, right? Or are you evolving over time? Obviously, we talked about that. So we're not going to go into it now, but I just thought that was so interesting. I'm like, look, like there's, other people definitely do wonder about this stuff too, right? I mean, it's true. Like, which version of
Yeah.
me am I being true to? 100%.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you so much, Stephen. This was pleasure talking to you. We talked about a lot of different things. It was fun. I enjoyed it.
I am glad you enjoyed it. Well, for anyone who would watch or listen to this, the only thing that I would say as I conclude this is prepare yourself and get ready for part two.